The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
For Vladimir Putin, quote, "The war is paying for itself." That according to one of Ukraine's top economic advisors, citing the ongoing revenue from Russian oil exports. Tonight, could Canada's oil and gas sector help stop the flow of hard currency into Russia? We'll consider that. Then, tax law expert Allison Christians explains how global cooperation on taxation could produce a more just world. It's Tuesday, March 29th, and that's ahead on the agenda.
Despite bans on Russian oil imports by Canada, the US, the UK, and others, Europe, China, and beyond continue to rely heavily on Russian energy exports, even as the war in Ukraine rages on. Canada, as the fourth largest oil producer in the world, has promised to step up to help reduce global reliance on Russian oil, gas, and even uranium for nuclear power. Can this country really make a substantial contribution? Let's ask. In Calgary, Alberta, Stacey McDonald, energy analyst and board member at Birchcliff Energy and Bonterra Energy. In New York, Rachel Ziemba, economic and political risk expert and founder of Ziemba Insights. And in Ontario's capital city, Rory Johnston, commodity analyst who writes a Substack called Commodity Context. Welcome everyone to the program tonight.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get a lay of the land when we talk about the world's top oil producers. I want to pull up a little chart here that will sort of set up the stage here. Starting with the US in navy blue on the left, 20% of the global oil supply comes from them. And working clockwise, the Gulf states, which include the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Kuwait in green, account for 14% of global oil supply. In indigo, Saudi Arabia accounts for 12%, Russia in purple, 11%, Canada in red, 6%, China in a darker green, 5%, Brazil in orange at 4%, and the remaining 28% in gray is found in smaller amounts across the globe. So my first question to you, I'm going to come to Rachel first. Looking at this pie chart, you would think that Canada, with 6% of the world's oil supply, might be in a good position to replace a significant chunk of what Western countries have vowed to avoid, Russian oil. Is it?
Thanks for having me. It's a good question. The challenge is that, so Canada's already producing a lot. They've already, in that way, the challenge is that Canada doesn't have spare capacity ready to go online tomorrow to replace some of these sort of supplies that we're seeing. And there are sort of limitations that we're seeing in almost any of the other producers. When we look around the world, the only places that really have spare capacity ready to go online in the next couple of days, weeks, months are really in OPEC, the Gulf states in particular. And that's a function of the fact that they've been slow and deliberate in returning oil supply to the market after the pandemic and the demand destruction, but also because they've invested over time and being willing to have more oil sort of ready to go so that they can sort of make money in that sort of volatility. So in Canada, like in the US, you've got private companies making decisions, and they don't necessarily want to invest in having lots of spare capacity on hand in this context. But the bigger question is whether over the next couple of months and years, production can increase. And that's where I think there's also the challenge that Canada has of getting the supplies to market. But we should highlight that, of course, Canada has been increasing production, but it faces some of the same labor constraints and supply chain constraints we've been seeing in other sectors.
Stacey, I'll come to you. Looking at that pie chart there, 6% of the world's oil supply. Can Canada actually fill that void there?
I mean, physically speaking, Canada has the reserves to be one of the largest oil producers in the world. The question is there a commitment from all levels of government and from the private companies to do that? And what we're seeing now is a result of 7 years of chronic underinvestment in Canada's energy sector. Frankly, at this point, outside of maybe 100 or 200,000 barrels a day, it's unlikely that Canada could offset any lost Russian oil supplies. There are a few projects in the works that are awaiting approvals from the federal government. There's a large project in Newfoundland, and the federal government's held off and delayed a decision on that for twice now. And that project alone could add 200,000 barrels a day and bring much needed jobs to Newfoundland and lots of economic activity. So it's a function of chronic underinvestment because a lot of these projects are long lead items. It's a product of regulatory uncertainty and delays, and both of those things cannot be fixed quickly. So in terms of adding material supplies, physically, Canada has the reserves to do it, but I think it would take a large commitment from government, and it probably wouldn't be 3 to 5 years until we saw those come online.
All right, and Rory, I'll get your take on this. Does Canada have what it takes to sort of fill that void as well?
Yeah, I always like to think of Canada, and I like to say that Canada is one of the, friendliest, most reliable producers of oil on the planet. However, we're also one of the slowest. Just by the nature of the structure of our oil industry, we have a very, very slow response time. Projects take a long time. We were expecting kind of incremental growth over the next couple of years, really through the balance of the decade, as a lot of those projects that were already, operational, as they began to kind of optimize and debottleneck. So there was some of that. But I think when you think about like a lot of the conversation about Canadian kind of supply contribution has come in the context of something like, whether or not the Biden administration should have canceled Keystone XL, and whether or not, if that pipeline appeared tomorrow, it could solve the entire Russia crisis. And unfortunately, our industry doesn't work like that, unfortunately. If the pipeline was built and came into service back in 2012 when it was initially supposed to, absolutely we could have filled that pipeline over that period of time, and we would have had much more Canadian oil to contribute to the situation right now. But unfortunately, even if the pipeline appeared tomorrow, just like Stacey was saying, it would take us years to fill the pipeline, and that's just because you need that certainty. You need to know that that's going to be there in order to invest up front in order to fill that.
It's not a conversation about oil and gas if we don't talk about pipelines, but I assure you we will touch on pipelines later on as well, Roy. Stacey, on this program in the past, when we talk about extracting oil, it's been described as easy as putting a straw in the ground, and that's as easy as it gets. When we compare that to how Canadian oil works, why is oil in the Middle East so much easier to get to market than Canadian oil?
Well, I think it's important to differentiate between what I would call conventional oil, which is large pools of oil, and what is often associated with Canada, which is oil sands, which is large mining projects and thermal projects or SAGD. So those projects typically have a longer lead time from when you start, construction on the project. So there's a misconception in the public that producers are holding back production and they just open up the taps, which is completely wrong. That's not how the industry works. But when you look at Alberta, even a SAGD project, if it started today, would take, at least 3 years before they see first production. So for a producer today to start a new project, to bring on new supplies to offset, there's a lot of things that need to happen that haven't happened yet and probably won't. So I don't expect to see any large mining projects come on stream maybe in my lifetime. The best Canada could probably do today would be getting some brownfield SAGD projects up and running and getting started.
Rory, I want to come to you. I think a lot of people get confused between the difference between oil, gas, and LNG. And of course, when we talk about LNG, we mean liquefied natural gas. Can you explain the difference for us between the three?
Yeah, so, oil, obviously, so when you really think about the kind of chemical composition, and really all hydrocarbons are just a gigantic bath of chemicals of hydrogen and carbon atoms. They're functionally the same thing, just at kind of different densities. So oil is, you think of oil, it's put into a refinery, you refine it to make diesel and gasoline and everything else. So those are what we call like liquid products. Gas is a lot of the same type of chemistry, but it's just much kind of looser hydrocarbons. And that's, natural gas goes into pipelines, goes in your house to heat your home, to, work your barbecue or your stove. In terms of a market, The biggest difference is that liquids are much easier to transport than gases are. This is where LNG comes in. It's quite expensive and technically complicated to liquefy natural gas and shrink it on, an order of, 300-fold or 400-fold to get into a tanker to make it economic to transport around the world. And the big result of this is that while we have an extremely global price of oil and market for oil, what's happening in Russia right now is throwing the entire global oil market and our prices into a tizzy. The gas market is much more balkanized or regionalized. So even while we've seen natural gas prices, soar to, unprecedented, wildly high levels in Europe, in North America, we have a much more captive gas market, and prices, while higher today, are much lower. And I think that's benefiting us because we're only seeing the oil price and the gasoline price shock. We're not to the same degree seeing a natural gas price shock for Canadians.
I'm going to follow up with you. You brought up the market, so I think it's fair we talk. Before the war in Ukraine, oil prices were already going up. Now they've skyrocketed. Can you give us an idea of why they were pre-war going up?
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to understand that, the Russia shock is massive, but even before Russia recrossed the border into Ukraine, the oil market was extremely tight. To give a sense of how tight, last year in 2021, the oil market on balance was undersupplied by about 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day, which is about 2% of global supplies. That was already enough to bring global visible inventory levels, which had reached all-time highs at the beginning of the COVID shock, back down to levels we hadn't seen since 2010 to 2014, back when we all generally thought that $100 oil was here to stay forever. So the market was extremely tight, and then you basically took, Russia, which is the second or third largest producer, neck and neck with Saudi Arabia, potentially a large chunk of it off the market, and you push that tight market into overdrive.
All right, I want to talk about a little bit of the big picture here. I'm going to come to Rachel. Canada and the U.S. recently vowed to stop importing Russian crude oil, and I think a lot of Canadians and Americans would sit there and scratch their head thinking, oh, we import Russian oil. And it should be mentioned that, it was mostly a symbolic gesture on the Canadian side. We haven't really imported crude oil since 2019. Why is Canada in the business of importing Russian oil?
Sure. So it's important to highlight that the volumes of what Canada was importing were very small. And I defer to Rory a little bit on this, who's dug through the very detailed data on this. But what Canada was importing were oil products, so specific blends. It's the same thing in the United States, actually. There's not a lot of crude oil that the United States was importing from Russia, but there are blending fuels, particular sort of grades that are that are sort of mixed into oil products. Now, in the U.S. case, what was going on was, in a sense, sanctions on Venezuela, dynamics and negotiation with Saudi Arabia, other things going on, in part a function of U.S. foreign policy, were actually increasing Russia's market share. Now, we want to put in context here, even for the U.S. that was importing some blending fuels, they were looking at, about 5% of oil and oil product imports are coming from Russia. About half of U.S. Oil and oil product imports come from Canada, back to the point about Canada being a reliable supplier. So this was a smaller amount in that context. And it's really a function of the fact that oil and oil products are global, that no matter how much is produced at home, that's a global market. In the U.S. context, unlike Canada, some of the biggest buyers of Russian oil were places like Hawaii, right, where all the sort of oil and gas that comes in has to be by sea, right? There's not a pipeline to get it there. And in the U.S. context, there's a rule called the Jones Act that makes it very difficult and more costly to send any goods from a U.S. port to another U.S. port. You have to use U.S. ships and U.S. personnel, and it's a legacy of the early 20th century. And so for some of those buyers, it was much more economical to buy from Russia than to buy from what was fairly far away in the Gulf Coast of the United States. So those dynamics are, very much those policy choices, whether foreign policy, imposing sanctions on Venezuela, or economic policy of trying to support the U.S. shipbuilding industry have an impact there. Now, the rest of the world, big Asian countries, energy companies in Europe, they were much more reliant on Russian oil and gas, and they're having a lot of questions now about whether they can pare it down. They don't want to buy Russian oil and gas right now, but they also don't want to. They don't want to pass on the extreme costs and volatility to their buyers.
Rory, I'm going to get some Canadian context because I know you recently looked into this as well. When we look at sort of the ban, who's the biggest loser here in Canada?
Yeah, and Rachel nailed it on the head. You know, we are talking about very small kind of volumes in the scheme of things. And you said that the last crude oil that was purchased was in 2019 in September. And that was interestingly, so the last place and really the dominant place that was buying Russian crude oil, much in the same way that Rachel mentioned for Hawaii, was Newfoundland and Labrador. And that was the Come By Chance oil refinery in Newfoundland and Labrador that was buying those barrels. And that was, again, because that was just a convenient way for them to get that type of crude. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, that refinery shut down because of economic reasons. And what you've seen is essentially since that point, we haven't imported a single more drop of Russian crude oil. Now, what we have continued to import is about 10,000 barrels a day. And just put in perspective, relative to a Canadian overall consumption of more in the ballpark of, 1.8 million barrels a day. But of that 10,000 barrels a day, most of it is gasoline and most of it's going to Quebec. So if you're talking about the single biggest loser, I guess the answer there would likely be Quebec and Quebec motorists. But again, we're talking about relatively small volumes of crude, relatively small volumes of gasoline. So really, we're only going to probably talk, a couple cents on the barrel likely of the difference. So I think it's mostly, as you said at the beginning, symbolic. But it was, Canada was the first one to ban these imports, and since then we've seen the U.S., the U.K., and Australia follow suit. So I think it was an important signal.
All right, I'm going to tap into Rachel. You're a political risk expert, so I'm going to ask you this, and Stacey, I'm hoping you can follow up on this. Canada and the U.S. are the only two countries in that earlier pie chart that can be considered sort of thriving democracies. And yes, as we mentioned, it's sort of a dirtier product, but geopolitically speaking, you'd say it's a safer product. Does that seem to matter at all?
I think it's mattering more now than it might have mattered a couple of months and years ago. In that context, I know many in the Canadian oil patch and the like have highlighted this sort of politically cleaner energy sort of question. I think the challenge that Canadian fuel has faced is that as there's been a decarbonization push globally, as there's been a focus on all of the energy required to get out the molecules, Stacey highlighted that most of the energy produced in Canada is unconventional and that requires a lot of inputs, that there's been this sort of divergence, especially in Europe, which has been really pushing on decarbonization, the concern about we might like cleaner politically, but we'd really prefer cleaner environmentally and lower costs. So as there's been this push of where to use the carbon budget, that's been a real challenge. Now, the Canadian producers and the governments have listened to some extent. There's been much more focus on trying to think about how to clean the life cycle of oil and gas products. There's a good question marks about how far that can go. But I do think this sort of question mark about where this fits with the energy transition and some of the very difficult sort of political debates around carbon taxes and the like in Canada, at least hopefully have forced industry to sort of adjust to what's really a global reality here. So ultimately, I think the interest in, we see that, but we see politically some of the situations have changed. We saw the Biden administration with European allies sort of basically commit to Europe buying more natural gas from the US over a long term. That is partly this Biden administration focus on having democracies work. The interesting sort of puzzle to me, in a sense, is sort of why Canada is not sort of part and parcel of some of those discussions, and that reflects some of the things that Stacey and Rory, have said. But ultimately, I think what we're now facing is a challenge of both matching this sort of short-term urgent resupply of fuel, making sure the global economy avoids a recession in the context of this shock, with also meeting the long-term goals of reducing the risk of a shock like this happening again, but also trying to meet these longer-term energy transition goals. And it's hard to get all of those, sort of catch all of those balls that are in the air.
All right, Stacey, I'll get your take on that. Does it seem to matter that this product's a bit is dirtier, but geopolitically a little safer?
I mean, it shouldn't matter. Ultimately, I think what's going on in Russia has shown that, energy security ultimately will come first for the population. I mean, the ability to heat your home and have food is going to be first and foremost above, citizens' long-term desires to reduce carbon emissions. So what I think has happened here is it's highlighted the fact that policymakers have restricted supply, but demand hasn't gone down. And now we're in a position with a supply shortfall and dealing with some bad actors. So I think there needs to be a lot of introspection from policymakers across, Western democracies on, it's one thing to beat down industry to restrict supply, but if demand doesn't go down, these issues are going to keep happening and they're going to keep getting worse. And the demand reduction forecasts are just not realistic with what's been happening in the real world. So if I'm a Western government, I would much rather have stable, reliable production from Canada and the US than relying on countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. And I think policymakers need to be really honest about that, because ultimately, if demand doesn't go down, the supply has to come from somewhere. And this is what we call carbon leakage. So if it's not coming from Canada, it's going to come from an unsavory place. So Canadians and Canadian policymakers need to acknowledge that fact. And I think that's been left out of the energy transition for a long time.
Rory, I want to come to you. With this conflict in Ukraine, do you think this will speed up or hinder the switch to clean energy?
I think it's going to do both in a funny way. I think on one hand, it's definitely going to accelerate the transition just because higher prices, or all else equal, are going to reduce demand faster than lower prices. And what we're seeing coming out of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is it seems like kind of higher prices, for a longer period of time. I think, to pivot back a little bit to blend this in with this discussion of energy security, I think, what I've been pushing for a long time is exactly as Stacey was saying, a focus on demand reduction. You can envision a future where Canada, as an example, consumes far less oil products, but is producing and exporting far more. And I think that, it's a double whammy. We could increase our production and reduce our consumption. That increases our relative export size on the global stage. And I think my hope coming out of this crisis is that, policymakers recognize that it's not just, a pure carbon accounting exercise when you look at a global kind of interconnected system. What we're seeing, particularly coming out of COVID, is this kind of decoupling of the global system. And I think that you need to take into account more than just a single carbon vector. You need to take into account security of supply. You need to take into account kind of, political realities in the countries when factoring for how kind of optimal those barrels are in your overall mix.
I see some head nodding from both. I'll go to Stacey. What is your take in terms of this moment now when we have a war? Do we go clean, or do we sort of go back and stay put sort of and rely on fossil fuels?
Similar to what Rory said, I think high prices support additional low carbon technologies. But ultimately, I think it will set the energy transition back. I think that, if this results in higher fuel costs, higher food costs, I think that the politicians and policymakers have a chance of losing the support of the population for some of these energy transition initiatives. And frankly, that's probably the right call, because higher food costs and higher gasoline costs are regressive, and they really hurt low-income people. And I think first and foremost, we need to focus on supply and the energy security that goes along with it. So I do think ultimately it'll hurt some of these energy transition initiatives, because I don't think the population is going to support the way it's been going if this keeps happening.
And Rachel, I'll get your take. Anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, as part of this kind of energy and political security piece, is that we are already seeing, and we'll probably see more, gas tax holidays or sort of cuts to prices, trying to smooth that for consumers for the very reasons that, for the very reasons we were just talking about. The challenge is that if anything, it might boost demand or keep demand level. So there needs to be kind of a broader assessment sort of on supply and demand and longer term trajectory. So there's a risk that in addressing the short term political challenges, which I completely agree are very real in Canada and around the world, but also sort of being realistic about how we're going to meet that demand. And in some ways, the situation we find ourselves in now, which was already building at the end of last year, particularly in Europe and in parts of Asia, was that we have a sort of a narrative about moving away from fossil fuels, but consumers that were still demanding it. And price-driven demand destruction is a pretty painful way to sort of adjust in that way. And so down the line, and this sort of broader point around food security is a really sort of important one. We're already seeing sort of higher natural gas prices feed into less natural gas-based fertilizer. Those couple with potash-related fertilizer sort of reductions out of Russia and Belarus because of sanctions. That might be good for Canadian sort of producers, but there's still really a challenge. All these systems are interconnected. And so I think being really realistic about sending the signals in the short term, but also investing for the long term, and realizing that sort of just adding more restrictions and in that way doesn't get us to a stable, more secure system.
As I promised, we would talk about pipelines, so this is the time to talk about it. I'm gonna come to Stacey. One of Canada's biggest obstacles in getting oil to market is pipelines and the infrastructure there, and it's a question that we've asked so many times on this program in the past. Why is it so hard to build pipelines in Canada?
I mean, frankly, what kills most of these projects is time. If you're looking at building a new large egress pipeline, you have to look at capital, shipping, but ultimately projects in Canada just take significantly longer to get done than they do in the US. And increased time increases regulatory risk, and it increases the cost of capital. So just one example, there's been a couple of reports, but building an LNG project in Canada comparable to a US project takes on average 19 months longer. Companies just don't want to build in Canada because they don't have regulatory certainty and they don't have timeline certainty. So that's the biggest thing that hurts in Canada. And it's extremely frustrating to see, because the important thing Canada can do is we have the resources. We just need to connect the supply to the market. So it's very frustrating.
Rory, I'll get your take on that. And I do want to add a little follow-up in there. Is it sort of a change in how we view pipelines as well, more as a vessel instead of the product? Like when we talk about clean energy, is there, if we put that infrastructure in and the investments there, that Canada might reap some benefits later down the line as well?
Yeah, and I think it's, everything that Stacey was saying is absolutely 100%, on point. And to your point about how these pipelines, one of the worst things that happened to the overall oil industry, and particularly the Canadian industry, is that pipelines move from boring infrastructure projects like highways to these kind of symbolic battlegrounds for the future of the global climate. And obviously you get a lot of kind of complexity, flattened down into this one particular project. But I mean, what we're seeing right now, interestingly, is that for the first time in almost a full decade, we've seen the Canadian industry actually at this exact moment, not pipeline constrained. We have very, very small differentials. We haven't needed to rely on rail. It's because we've got the Enbridge Line 3 replacement project that's finally come on stream. We're going to be getting the Trans Mountain expansion project online, hopefully anytime now into 2023, maybe early 2024. But I think when you think about the future and you think about the ability for Canadian industry to grow production and these kind of good friendly barrels kind of continuing to increase market share, the challenge is it's hard to imagine a private entity like TC Energy, what used to be TransCanada, or Enbridge or Kinder Morgan or any of the major pipeline companies. It's hard to imagine them staking a considerable commercial risk on building a new pipeline across the border again. It's just so impossible to achieve. So what we saw with the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline was obviously Ottawa effectively nationalized the pipeline, took it under federal ownership, effectively exercised kind of federal supremacy here and its ability to push through some of the provincial bottlenecks that we were facing, between Alberta and BC, for instance. And I for better or worse, I wonder if the future of pipeline construction in Canada is going to be one of nationalized projects that are effectively owned, operated by the government until such time that they are done, and then they can be resold to the private sector to manage. And I think that is not going to be a comfortable reality for many people in the industry, but I think that if we get another pipeline after Trans Mountain expansion, at this point right now, I think that's probably the way it's going to look.
Rachel, I'm going to come to you. It's a pipeline that I didn't think we would be talking about, the Keystone. Thought it was done in 2021, and maybe I'm joking here, but is the Keystone really dead forever, or does this change things at all?
Well, never say never. I mean, I think a lot of people in the industry and in Canadian government have a lot more gray hairs as a result of the pipeline. So, I mean, on the one hand, never say never. On the other hand, I do think that the political sort of capital and other things like that, it's not clear to me that there's the political will to sort of, revive that. It's been notable to me. Yes, there have been U.S., in a sense, the very same people in the U.S. who were against killing it in the first place at the beginning of last year have come out and said, well, this could be, sort of the solution. I think kind of focusing in on other issues, other ways of getting this sort of fuel to market, and maybe even other ways of coordination and bilateral relationships in this way might be more fruitful. The issue, though, is I think focusing in on areas of broader, broader, longer term interest. I mean, the sort of issues that are faced on a bilateral basis around not just oil and gas, but also power exports and the like, of course, are politically fraught. And navigating this in a context where, yes, the U.S. wants reliable energy, but also is moving towards much more sort of onshoring in a variety of areas. And so I think there's an element for Canada, even in the energy sector, of sort of picking battles and, particularly on infrastructure projects that are closer to sort of being done or nearer sort of payouts.
In the last sort of 2 minutes that I have, I do want to ask this question, Stacey and Rory. I'll start with Stacey. What are the lessons you hope our leaders are taking away from the war in Ukraine as it pertains to Canadian oil and gas?
I mean, I think that the biggest lesson they should see is that, Russia was able to use their energy resources politically and in a way where they could go into Ukraine. Canada has a role to play here, especially on the LNG side. We have some of the largest natural gas resources in the world, and we would have the ability to ship LNG to Europe from the East Coast of Canada and to Asia from the West Coast. Over the last 10 years, the Americans have built probably 10 LNG projects, and over the last 15 years, we'll be lucky to get one done. So if anything, I think Canada contribute resources to market that can stabilize both in Asia and in Europe. So Canada does have a role to play here, but it's going to take a commitment from all levels of government to get our safe, reliable resources to market.
All right, and Rory, what are the lessons our leaders can take away from sort of what's going on when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine when it comes to Canadian oil and gas?
I think the biggest thing to take into consideration here is that this industry moves very slow. We need to be very, very purposeful, very, very thoughtful, and forward-looking in our decisions. I think after oil prices collapsed in 2014, as an example, a lot of people more or less wrote the industry off, that this wasn't something that needed, love and care anymore. It was just something that was going to more or less keep producing until we didn't need it anymore because everything was electrified. And I think that set up a false sense of security about kind of the effort and risks inherent in that energy transition. We are undeniably heading towards a decarbonized net zero future, but the path, the drive along that bridge to transition is going to be fueled in many cases by gasoline and diesel until we've fully displaced those fuels from our mix. And I think even just to tie it back momentarily to the pipeline conversation, as Rachel pointed out, it's not just oil and gas pipelines. It's power lines down to New England. It's everything. And if you think that the oil and gas, the traditional hydrocarbon economy is particularly, infrastructure intense, just wait until you see, the renewable energy kind of grid. It's going to be much more energy infrastructure intense. You're going to need much more physical infrastructure involved through the entire system to make it work. And we're going to need to get to a stage where we're comfortable building kind of big mega infrastructure projects again in North America, in Canada, and across our border in order to facilitate that necessary transition.
Rachel, Rory, Stacey, thank you so much. Great discussion, great insights. I felt like I learned a lot. Thank you for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Who should pay what level of taxes is a common debate in wealthy democratic countries. Calls for the rich or big business to pay more are also very familiar. But mostly those conversations leave out some important context, that those countries exist within a global economy and thus an international tax system. Allison Christians is professor and chair of tax law at McGill University and co-author of a new book that argues it's time to take that more seriously. The book is called Tax Cooperation in an Unjust World. And Allison Christians joins us now from Montreal, Quebec for more. Professor Christians, great to see you again. How are you managing tonight?
Very well, and it's great to be with you. Thank you.
Not at all. We've sort of hinted at what the premise of the book is, but why don't you put a little more flesh on that bone? Why'd you write this and why now?
Well, why'd I write this? Because I think we don't think too much or deeply enough about what it means to be interconnected in a global economy when we're thinking about our tax system. We're often just thinking about our own domestic concerns, but always our tax system builds up and functions within the context of a larger global tax and trade system with a bunch of rules that affect us and our decisions affect others. So that's the sort of context of why I think that we need a book to think about what are the normative concepts in how we design our tax system in the context of the economic situation. And why now? Well, I always write about tax law and I always think about tax law in the international context, but now the world has kind of joined me. Canada and 135 other countries are in the midst of talks, global talks about whether there should be minimum taxes on a global basis, especially for large multinationals. So the book is in a way responding to that conversation that we're already part of.
Well, I don't know if you sent a copy of your book to Joe Biden, but apparently the president thinks enough of the idea that he's proposed something just yesterday. But let me get you to weigh in on I guess one of the main points that you're trying to make in this book, which is that wealthy countries have, let's put it this way, they're claiming more wealth than they may morally be entitled to, which of course raises the question about what do you think they're morally entitled to or not. Can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, so it's a complex idea, and it's not everybody's cup of tea to sit around and think about the moral imperative of the economic system. But what do we think we're entitled to when we're building a tax system? We think, well, we can tax our people and we can tax our companies. But when our companies go overseas, can other countries tax them too? And if other countries tax them too, what should we do in response? We sort of think of ourselves as entitled to the income that arises in Canada, for example. And we think, well, if you come to Canada and you do business in Canada, we ought to be able to tax that. But we've seen in the last decade or so, lots of companies coming to Canada that we haven't really been able to tax. And I think among them, the big platforms have been in the news on occasion that we've just struggled to tax these companies. And the same struggle is being felt by other countries when our companies go there. And so the impetus of all of this idea of, well, what are we entitled to tax starts with the idea that the nation state is a body with legitimate power to tax. And then the question is, how much do you have to cooperate with other nations when you're already cooperating on trade and capital flows? How much do you then have to cooperate on tax? So in the book, we talk about this idea that the state is in some way entitled to tax the people, the companies that operate in the jurisdiction. And that's kind of something that people accept. But then the thing that's sort of harder to explain or harder for people to come to agreement on is, well, but when two states collide, when they both think that the taxpayer is operating in their jurisdiction, what are our obligations to deal with each other, to cooperate with each other? And that's really the question that this book is trying to get at. Come up with some kind of idea about, well, what are the terms for our cooperation when we go and talk to other countries and make agreements about what the tax system should look like.
And why do you think that's been such a tough nut to crack for so long?
Well, I think because justifiably, when people think about taxation, they think about what they are paying to their own government. And it's really hard. It gets more complex the more complicated you think about, well, which taxpayers are paying what tax to which countries. It's really hard to keep that in focus when you're concerned on a daily basis with your own tax situation. So it might be easy to say, well, I pay taxes as an individual, but the big conglomerate beside me is not paying tax, and think, well, that's unfair. They should pay tax too. But it's a little harder to say, but to which country should they pay tax? And how should we go into negotiations with other countries? Like, is it okay for Canada to go into a negotiation with another country and just say, well, this is our term, these are our terms, take them or leave them? Or is it okay for Canada to create a agreement with a few countries, but then treat other countries differently? Is it even okay for Canadian businesses to go into, for example, conflict zones or post-conflict zones and start operating there and producing income that country can't tax? Just how should we think about those things? This really feels remote to you when you think in terms of your own situation in the context of your daily life. These are hard questions to try to answer.
Indeed. But do you accept the premise or the notion that if there were, say, a minimum corporate tax or even a tax on billionaires, that every country in the world, for argument's sake, signed on to the notion that it ought to be in place, that there would be a lot less shopping around for lower tax jurisdictions by companies, and there would be more tax fairness in the world? Do you buy that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the idea, right? And in the book, we kind of go through why it's hard to get to that place, because you can make a commitment to minimum taxation, but then you have to think about, well, minimum taxation on what base, and how do you decide who decides what constitutes the income to be taxed, and then how do they divvy it up? So there's always some difficult coordination problems in that. But yeah, the basic idea is if the big countries like the US and collectively Europe, if they start taxing at a global minimum rate of 15%, then it makes it easier for other countries to also raise their tax rates to that amount. And when those big countries don't tax at a minimum rate, then what we have seen in the past is what they call the race to the bottom on corporate taxes, where each country tries to lower their tax rate just a little bit to attract the capital there. And so this is a backstop idea where if you just have a minimum by the major economies, then smaller countries, smaller open economy countries can also follow suit. And then it makes it less lucrative for tax planners to look around the world and look for a lower tax rate somewhere, because it simply doesn't exist. There's always this backstop. That's the idea, the general idea.
Well, let's really get into the weeds here, okay? This is going to be Tax Policy 101 here for some of us who don't follow this as carefully as you do. The notion of double taxation. What is that, and why do so many businesses have a problem with it?
Yeah, so you can picture a Canadian company starting out in Canada and paying taxes to Canada, and on the whole, not objecting too much to being a taxpayer. You know, they benefit from the system in Canada. They use the roads and the transportation and the communication infrastructure that we built for them. You know, so they pay back into Canada. We think that's good. Now this company starts operations overseas. Well, Canada says, well, it doesn't sort of matter too much where your income comes from. We think, you know, you're a taxpayer here, you should pay tax here. And the company says, yes, but I'm also paying tax in that other country. So now I might have the same income, two different countries saying that I have to pay tax to them, hence double taxation. So that was a big problem for a long time. You know, in the history of taxation, countries have always tried to solve that problem with tax treaties and agreements where they decide, well, one country will tax and the other will not, or they'll credit one tax from one place to the other. They sort of work that out. But then somewhere along the way, when you start getting favorable tax incentives in some places, you know, low tax rates, what started happening is that it got easier to find a place where you could go where they wouldn't tax it. And then we also wouldn't tax it because we had our own incentives and our own deductions. And all of a sudden you had companies that if they went to certain places, they could avoid tax in Canada legally, and they could also avoid tax in that other country legally. And sometimes that was intended, but sometimes it wasn't. And when we say it's not intended, that's not what governments really want. They sometimes call that double non-taxation. And you could just call it non-taxation. Let's be clear. It just means no tax. But the reason you might call it double non-taxation is because it's usually the product of tax agreements that have been coordinated, that have been agreed to. So the governments have agreed to some kind of deal. And then as a result of that deal, the taxpayer found themselves in a favorable place where they had to pay no tax to either country. Whether you should fix that has been a question that has bothered global tax policymakers for many years. And not everybody agrees that you should fix that.
Well, you've anticipated my follow-up, which is basically if nirvana is a situation where all the nations of the world agree on what a fair and basic tax rate ought to be, and they cooperate accordingly, how far from nirvana are we right now in your judgment?
Well, we're still pretty far. Even though I think we have the right ideas. So we're closer than we were 5 years ago, I'll say, in the sense that you hear policymakers and politicians talking about minimum taxes and relating minimum taxation to the concept of fairness and fair taxation. So that's a good step in the right direction. But I think we're still pretty far because, of course, it's really complicated to think about global tax in the globalized economy. It's really hard to kind of wrap your hands around what that actually means in practice. And as a result, you have it's easy to talk about a minimum tax, but it's the devil's in the details as always. It's a lot harder to see if we actually are agreed on what we mean when we say that there should be a minimum tax.
All right. As people in Canada, people watching this or listening to this right now, consider the rate of taxation that they are paying right now, how does the international situation that you've described affect all of that?
Yeah, so I think for most people, the idea that companies should pay a basic minimum rate of 15% might even seem low to them. I think for a lot of people who face a tax rate twice that or more might think 15% seems low. And then some people might think, no, you shouldn't have corporate tax at all. So there's certainly division in terms of how people understand the corporate tax. But I will say this, the revenue projection is that if you can sort of lift the bottom so that there's a basic minimum rate, then maybe you come up with revenues that will pay for public programs that we want. And so that could be a game changer in terms of funding social programs that people want. This all is still conjecture, though. We have to wait and see if we get to a place where those new revenues are in fact in our hands. But you can see politicians, already anticipating those new revenues. You see it in budget projections that, new revenues bring the possibility to pay for new programs. So there is a connection between, these big ideas of international tax and what's coming out of your wallet and what things cost in Canada. It's just a long and fairly convoluted path from one to the other.
Well, let me give you a for instance here, and you tell me if this makes any sense. Let's say I'm a taxpayer in country X, and I like the way that country X has set up its tax system. I think it's fair. It obligates me to pay certain taxes. I legally avoid what I can, but I don't evade illegally what I shouldn't. And then I see country Y over there, and they don't have, as nice or as splendid a tax system in place. And I start to ask myself, why should I pay additional taxes to deal with their unbalanced situation when I'm doing everything I should be here in country X, playing by the rules, etc.? What's the answer to that?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on why you think country Y is behaving in the way that it's behaving. Is it behaving in that way because it's trying to take advantage of your country's good tax system? Because that might provoke a response that says, well, we need to get cooperation so that everybody's working together to get a strong tax system. But if you think country Y is acting that way because they can't produce the kind of tax system that we have in country X, where maybe country X is Canada, and we have a very sophisticated tax system, we have very capable people, thinking about the policies for Canada, but maybe country Y doesn't have those resources. So another theme of this book is to think about that problem differently, to think about country Y. If country Y just simply doesn't have the capacity to build the same tax system, then they're not trying to take advantage of Canada. They're trying to they're trying to produce their own economic growth and fairness within the confines of the resources available to them. And in that sense, we shouldn't work against country Y, or we shouldn't think that country Y is a bad actor, but instead we should be building a system that makes it possible for country Y to achieve their goals without undermining our goals for our system. That's hard, but that's the point of this global minimum tax as well.
And I take your point, but what if I'm the finance minister of country X, which again thinks it's doing everything fine, realizes the problems country Y has, but we think we're doing it right here. And I, as the Minister of Finance, just happened to note that my deficit last year was $385 billion. Oh, and country Y would like a change in the international tax system because their deficit's probably even worse. But frankly, I don't care that much about country Y, and none of my electors are in country Y. I'm worried about how I'm going to pay off that $385 billion so my grandchildren and great-grandchildren aren't paying higher taxes for the rest of their lives. How do we fix that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is exactly where the global minimum tax discussion comes in. That is one of the reasons that you might have a problem funding your government at the rate that you want as a deficit, as you described, might be because you haven't been effectively able to have the tax policy you want, not because you're not capable of doing it, but because globally you're not competitive if you create the tax system that you think you need to fund your social programs. And so the answer to that is not more competition. That's what drives down tax revenues. Instead, it is this idea that through cooperation, we build a bare minimum floor, and that makes it easier for us to raise the revenues we need as well as other countries. So the idea of the global minimum tax is to curb countries that aren't taxing enough to the extent that that action affects the countries that do want to tax more. So we're sort of being a little bit abstract here. Maybe the way to say that is this: if Canada, has a budgetary need and can't find the revenues because all of the capital has moved offshore to find a lower tax rate, a global minimum tax is designed to change that idea, change that ratio, and so that capital isn't always looking for, a lower tax rate somewhere else, but just settles in at paying what we consider to be a modest, relatively acceptable amount of tax everywhere they go, which the world has decided right now is 15%.
Okay, when described that way, that makes more sense to me. In our last 20 seconds here, then, how about this? This sounds impossible to achieve, what you have described. Then again, so would have been countries which used to go to war with each other on a fairly regular basis, all sharing the same currency, which is now the case in the euro. So the art of the possible here. How long do you think it'll take?
I think with a lot of situations involving economic policy and normative policy, the normative policy of fairness, there's not an end somewhere in the future, but rather it's a path that we're always on and always revisiting the terms thereof. So I think, are we closer to getting to a place where we can say we are doing better than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago on this? I think we are. And in 5 or 10 years, will we say we've accomplished something that we hadn't before? I don't know. There's a lot of backsliding when it comes to creating policy because the context changes. So what makes sense to some countries today might not make sense in 5 years. And I don't know if we've moved forward or moved back or maybe stayed in the same place. But what's important, I think, is that the more we talk about what really should drive our policy, it's economics, yes, but it's also fairness. That fairness is a factor when we're thinking about what our tax policy is, and that our global situation is, we can't just ignore it and just say it's just us. We have to think about what we do in relation to other countries. Then there's a possibility that we can make better policy as a result. That's the hope of the book. I think that's the hope of the global community right now. It doesn't really give us a good timeline, because I just said it's forever, but I think that's the right answer.
Well, I don't know anybody who's better able to explain what's on that path than you. And we thank you for not only joining us on the agenda tonight, but we remind people your book is called Tax Cooperation in an Unjust World, and we're glad that it brought Allison Christians to TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, March 29th, 2022. Ontario just landed a multi-billion-dollar auto sector investment to manufacture batteries in Windsor for electric vehicles. Tomorrow, we'll assess whether it's the EV game changer that people hope it will be. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.